What is your worst airline experience? Flew from one side of North America to the other, from Montreal to Vancouver to catch a flight to Saskatoon. Imagine flying from NYC to LA to catch a flight to Nebraska after my original Montreal-Toronto Regina flight got cancelled due to a storm. But the plane got stuck on the Montreal tarmac due to another storm, and by the time we took off for the 5-hour flight I knew I'd missed the connection. Sat in the food court at the Vancouver airport overnight. When I finally got to Saskatoon a day late, found out my suitcase was back in Montreal. I had a cold and my ears were plugged. When we were descending, it felt like they were going to explode. I tried to valve 2 or 3 minutes, and then they finally hissed for about 10 seconds until all the pressure was released. Turbulence, so bad that if you weren't wearing a seatbelt you were going to get hurt. I'm not a nervous flyer, and I've flown a lot, but the woman next to me was not and had a death grip on my arm. She was about as panicked as anyone I've ever seen on a plane. Eyes wild, completely silent, and as rigid as a stone. I just kept saying, "It's just turbulence, we're fine," but she was gonzo. I had basically a red marks and bruising on my forearm. Taking off from Athens on an Olympic Airlines Boeing 727 back in 1988, one of the engines caught on fire at the plane accelerating. The plane came to a stop on the runway as the cabin filled with a bit smoke, and the plane was towed back to the terminal as we were still inside coughing away. They let us out of the plane through the rear door, therefore we had to walk under the burning engine. The 727 has 3 engines, which were attached to the plane tail. They took us to the terminal, but we could clearly see the plane and a man fiddling with the engine with just a spanner. 4 hours later they put us back on the same plane, and we had to hope that tightening a few bolts on a brining engine had fixed the problem. I can tell you that everyone was completely silent the whole flight. Even the cabin crew looked extremely nervous and gave each other concerned looks whoever the plane experienced a bit of turbulence. I have never been a comfortable flyer since then. SYD to SFO. And a guy a couple rows behind me died 4 hours into the flight. I watched them attempt CPR for a while. It was horrible. We had to go back to Sydney and all figure out flights the next day. It was my own fault, but I drank too much and I woke up as we were descending. I was dehydrated and hungover. Spirit. Downgraded from business to economy, and seated in the front row with a perfect view of people in our seats getting served champagne and sleeping all night in the lie-flat beds. 2 aborted landing attempts into a typhoon in Japan. Vomit everywhere. No fuel left. Never flew, but I heard and smelt fuel. The Swissair crash off Pegasus Cove. Joined in the search too. That was hell. Flying over the Nevada desert. The turbulence wasn't bad, but it was constant for 40 minutes. I didn't have a barf bag in front of me, so I removed my shoes just in case I needed a vessel. Never barfed, but the nausea and headache stuck with me for a day and a half. Lost my phone in my seat. Asked to go back for it. Was refused. Asked someone to go back for it. Was told it wasn't on the plane. I said I had it on the plane and then didn't when I got off. Where else could it be? Was told it wasn't, and that was the end of it. Had to buy a burner. 2 weeks later I was informed that my phone had been found on the plane. Fucking dipshits. My cousin was on a short flight when one of the engines fell off. The plane crashed. She was one of the few people to survive. Jet fuel splashed on her and caught fire. She was burned 90% of her body. She was in a burn unit for years. I once flew on Air Canada within Canada. I almost had to declare bankruptcy. A decompression over Mexico. The plane's air masks dropped and the plane started a very quickly descent, which made the plane a rough ride. I was in the bathroom at the time and tried to make my way to my seat. Wasn't quite like the movie Castaway, but I was the Tom Hanks of that flight. There was no announcements other than put your seatbelts on. As far as knew we were crashing. Also, I realized I never listened to the announcement before flight on how to use those masks. Once we leveled off, we took a hard right into the desert to land at the nearest airport. Stopped flying for a while. Took a long time to be comfortable in the air again. Pilot had to abort a landing in Manila because a typhoon nearby was causing some nasty storms. We must have been just a few feet from the runway. He explained that he had to go around for another landing and he sounded shaken. I've taken thousands of flights in my life and I've never been so concerned about getting back on the ground. The worst part was that it was a connecting flight and I had to take off back into the storm an hour later. Being outsourced after working for one for 13 years. I once had to take a 30-minute connecting flight, which was a tiny maybe 10-15 passenger plane. They actually told one woman she couldn't come because she was too heavy and we were at capacity. Anyways, as we were taking off, a large bolt screw came off of the interior of the plane and landed on the aisle near me. The flight attendant sitting diagonally from me scooped it up and says, "Don't worry, this happens all the time." I was just looking at her like, "Ma'am, What and the second time, which may have been worse, but also wasn't really the airline's fault, was when we were coming back from our honeymoon. But the airport we were landing in BWI flooded. So we circled another airport in Virginia for an additional 4 hours until we were cleared to land. Then since we were an international flight, when we landed, we were all put in a holding room basically detained, because customs wasn't open to do whatever they needed with our passports. There was no food available to us other than vending machines, which our huge flight cleared out quickly. A few hours later we were loaded back onto the plane and taken to our original destination airport. They gave us 200 vouchers per person, which I thought was nice considering it was a result of a literal natural disaster weather. I was in a Chinook when the rear engine went out and it was sort of dragging us across Baghdad. Also the guys on my left and right had my seatbelt buckles and I was just left to hold on to that mesh netting until we landed. My flight to the Dominican Republic. 7HR flight and me, my mom and my aunt were cursed with not one, but 2 screaming children sat directly behind us. And I mean screaming, absolute top of their lungs. Like seriously, the older girl, who I'm guessing was 2-3, had a set of pipes that make an opera singer proud, and she was sat right behind me. Remember how I said 2 children? Well, when one stopped screaming calmed down, the other one a young boy, I'd guess 1 or 2 would start, and it alternated the entire plane ride, where there was maybe a half hour to an hour break in total because they fell asleep. By the time we landed, everyone looked like they'd just hiked their way across the ocean instead of flying. Me, my mom and my aunt all had headaches and pointedly avoided eye contact with the parents as we got off.